So what does Hume mean by free will, or as he calls it, liberty? Well, he defines it for us. By liberty, then, we can only mean a power of acting or not acting according to the determination of the will, i.e., if we choose to stay still, we may do so. And if we choose to move, we may do that. This hypothetical liberty, hypothetical because it concerns what we may do if we choose, is universally agreed to belong to everyone who isn't a prisoner in chains. There's nothing to disagree about here. Okay. So, we can derive from this a sort of more general definition. So Hume thinks a person is free to the extent that their behavior is determined by their choices. So that if you choose to do something, you'll do it. And if you choose not to do it, you won't. Right? This is hypothetical liberty. It's sometimes called a conditional analysis of freedom. Conditional and hypothetical meaning basically the same thing. So, is he right that everyone agrees that everyone who's not a prisoner has this? It seems like it. Like if you're a prisoner and you're in chains, right? You're sitting in some room and someone's chained you to the wall, and you choose to get up and leave, you won't. You can decide like, today's the day I'm getting out of here. You stand up, the chains stop you from moving. Okay, so everyone agrees the prisoner doesn't have that kind of freedom. At least not when it comes to leaving the room. They might have it with regards to other things. Like the prisoner might decide, I'm going to spit all day. Right? I'm just going to keep spitting. I'm going to see how far I can hawk a loogie. Well, they can do that. They're free with regards to that. Right? So while I put this in terms of a person is free to the extent that, you could also just say a person is free to do some particular thing when, if they chose it, they would do it. Now, there are other situations where plausibly you would lack this freedom besides just being a prisoner. There are cases of what you might think of as internal compulsion, right? So the chains are an external compulsion. They constrain you, really. But there's other kinds of things that stop you from doing things you choose. Let's say you have some kind of obsessive personality disorder, right? Let's say you have the stereotypical kind, the hand washing kind. You can't stop washing your hands. A useful compulsion to have in the age of COVID. Probably still not good overall, but like a little bit better, right? Let's say you have that compulsion. Well, a person with that compulsion could very well decide, I got to stop washing my hands 500 times a day, right? It's killing my skin. And then they'll just go right on washing their hands. Or a person with addiction who's like, I don't want to take heroin. I've decided not to take any more heroin, right? And then later that day, they're taking heroin. But those are exactly the kind of cases where we would say, well, yeah, that person's not free. So Hume seems to be right here, that people usually have this. People usually have the feature of having their behavior depend on their choices. And where people do lack it is exactly the kinds of cases where we say people aren't free. Now, here's the question. Does this kind of freedom, assuming for the moment that Hume is right, that this is what freedom consists in, does this kind of freedom look like it will continue to exist, or will it exist in the case of determinism? Well, yeah. In fact, as Hume says elsewhere, I don't think he says it in this book, it seems like not only could it be true that we're free if determinism is true, it seems like determinism almost guarantees that we're free. Why? Well, because we have a certain kind of effect, our behavior, our publicly observable behavior. And what freedom involves, according to this definition, is that behavior being determined or necessitated or caused by our choices. Now imagine what would be the case if determinism weren't true. Imagine what would be the case if some events just happened with no cause at all. And that's what Hume thinks, by the way, is the only alternative to necessity, or as I'm calling it, determinism, is uncaused events. Because Hume thinks it's just true by definition that if X causes Y, then X necessitates Y. That's a feature of his account of what causation is. That if one thing causes another, it's the exact same thing as saying one thing necessitates another. Right? It means they've always gone together in the past, and we expect them to always go together in the future. Right? So Hume thinks the alternative to determinism is just sometimes stuff happens with no cause. He doesn't think that ever is true, but he thinks if you thought that determinism was false, or that necessity, the doctrine of necessity, as he puts it, was false, you'd have to think that some events were uncaused. Well, if some events are uncaused, and if they're events that are relevant to us and our freedom, that seems like it would just be, Hume's thinking, our behavior being uncaused. In which case, our behavior isn't determined by our choices because it's not determined by anything, so we're not free. Right? So not only does Hume think determinism is compatible with freedom, it looks like he might think determinism is necessary for freedom. Like you can't be free unless determinism is true. Now, why think that this is the right definition, though? I gave you a little bit of a reason why you would think it. I said, well, look at the cases where people lack this. Look at cases where people's behavior is not determined by their choices. And those are cases where we would say people are unfree. Now, there's another way to look at it, or there's another test to subject this definition to, which I'll get back to in a minute, which is look at other, instead of looking at cases where someone doesn't have their behavior determined by choices and asking whether they're free or unfree, look at all the cases where we say people are unfree and ask whether in every case their behavior is not determined by their choices. But for now, I want to, instead of testing Hume's definition, I want to provide the sort of ultimate basis for Hume's definition, like why he ultimately thinks this is true. It's not just that he thinks this matches how we talk about freedom. It's that he thinks if you really are clear about it, when we care about freedom, what we care about is the conditions under which we can treat people in certain ways. Right? So normally, we all think we're under an obligation to not gratuitously hurt people. Right? You shouldn't just go around making people feel bad. Like if you're at the mall and it's Christmas time and you see kids waiting in line for Santa, and you're the kind of person who just goes up to all the kids and says, "Hey kids, Santa's not real. Your parents made him up. I wonder what else they're lying about." Then you're just a terrible person. You're not funny or interesting. You're just awful. In fact, you're awful in an incredibly boring way. Whenever I say this, I always hope that there's some student in class who thinks behavior like that is clever, and I like putting them down because that shit makes me angry. I just cursed in the video. Oh well. You shouldn't cause gratuitous harm. If you see a homeless person, you shouldn't kick their bowl with their money in it and make them go scurrying after the change. Right? If someone's having a rough day, you shouldn't chime in and just try to make it worse. Right? Say you find out somebody's spouse just left them. Don't say, "Well, you're probably never going to find anyone better." Right? That's just awful. You're an awful person. In general, we shouldn't make people feel bad. But there is this set of cases, this certain kind of situation, where we all seem to think it's cool to make people feel bad. And I think it too. This isn't a put down. This isn't like me making fun of the person who likes to tell kids there's no such thing as Santa. Right? There are cases where it seems like it's okay to me too, to just make people feel bad. And that is when they've done bad stuff, right? So let's go back to the very case we just had. Imagine that kind of person who thinks they're clever and witty and daring because they're going to tell kids there's no Santa Claus, right? And imagine that then they hear their professors say that they're actually dumb and boring, right? And just the worst. And no one should ever date them. And I've said all these things now. I mean all those things. Well, what's the point of me saying that, right? If it was wrong for them to make the little kids feel bad, to remove their hat, to get rid of their happiness waiting to meet Santa, then why isn't it bad that I'm like putting that person down for doing it? If we're not supposed to hurt people's feelings, if we're not supposed to make people feel bad, if we're not supposed to make people suffer. Well, the difference is the kids didn't do anything wrong. And that person who told them there's no Santa Claus did do something wrong. Right? And when people do wrong, most of us seem to think it's time for a Twitter pile up, right? Or pile on. A pile up is a bunch of car crashes. A pile on is like someone says something stupid on Twitter, and so you race there to be one of the first ones to tell them that how awful a person they are, so that you get a bunch of retweets and likes, or things that happen on Snapchat. I don't know. But we seem to think it's okay when someone misbehaves to just say mean things to them. Usually deeply, deeply critical things about their character, about their person, right? Their personality. This is what you might call blame, right? When people behave poorly, we feel it's appropriate to criticize them in rather harsh ways. Sometimes that can rise to the level not just of criticism, but of what we more ordinarily would call punishment. Right? So let's say instead of going and telling kids who are waiting to see Santa at the mall that there's no Santa, you just go and you start kicking the kids, like in the face, right? They're low to the ground. It's easy to get to them. Well, then we're not just going to say, you're a terribly boring and stupid person. We're going to put you in a tiny box. We're not going to let you leave for a while. Right? And then when you leave, we're going to put you on a list that says everyone around you knows that you're terrible. We've told them. Right? Actually, you probably wouldn't go on a list for that. There's probably no lists for like people who assault kids in the normal punching them or kicking them in the face way, which just seems silly. Like, wouldn't you want to know if your neighbor like randomly just punched children? I would want to know. Anyway, punishment and blame are the intentional causing of some level of suffering to other human beings. But we think, most of us do, not everybody, most of us think that can be legitimate. It can be legitimate if the person is genuinely guilty of a crime. If, in other words, they have a certain kind of behavior. Right? If they've exhibited a certain kind of behavior. But Hume wants to point out, it's not the behavior we actually care about. You might think, of course it's a behavior we care about. I don't want someone punching kids in the face or kicking them in the face, as the case may be. And he thinks, yeah, that's true. We definitely want to prevent that, right? But when we're punishing the person who did it, right, we're not just caring about the behavior. If all we cared about was the behavior, then we would be perfectly fine just putting the person in a situation where there's no kids, right? And to make the example like really horrible, and I'm going to here talk about I'm going to try to get your moral sentiments going in exactly the way Hume would suggest, although I'm going to use a more extreme example than him. But just a warning, I'm going to be talking about sexual assault, right? So if you want to avoid that, move forward right, in the video. Skip this part. Very few people think that the proper solution to something like the sexual assault of children is just to get children away from the person who does it, right? Like suppose someone came out with a law and said, we've got a new punishment for people who sexually assault children. We're just going to pick a county, maybe make it an island. Like the United States has bought an island and we've paid the people who used to live there millions of dollars each for them to move. And now we're just going to put the people who commit sexual assault there and there won't be any children there. The behavior won't continue. And then you just say like, and now they get to like live on this tropical island and it's fun and they enjoy themselves, right? Like no one would be cool with this, right? I mean, like maybe the people who do that stuff would be cool with it, but no one would think this is okay. It stops the behavior, right? Like if you just found a way to quarantine people who like to assault children so that they never get around children, but that's all you do. You don't make their existence bad in some way. You don't hurt them in some way. You don't try to make them like feel the wrongness of what they've done. You just say, well, the problem was they engaged in a certain kind of behavior, so we're going to find a way to stop them from engaging in that kind of behavior. Most people will be like, that's not enough. right? It's not just the behavior we care about, right? It's why they did what they did. It's the fact that they chose to do it. It's the fact that they like to do it is the problem. Right? As Hume points out, we don't punish people as much for actions that are done out of character, right? So if you know a person who's just like really mean all the time and you see them be mean again, you're going to come down harder on them than if you have a really kind friend who out of the blue just acts in a mean way. If that happens, right, you're going to like wonder like what's going on with them? I wonder why they're acting this way. Maybe they're going through a struggle and I need to help them. Whereas if it's the awful person who's always that way, you just think, I'm going to let the air out of their tires. Right? Or, I mean, that's probably an extreme reaction. But like, we socially ostracize such people. We find ways not to invite them to things. We find ways to like not promote them at work. And in case you're wondering, right, this is exactly the kind of stuff that gets you left off email lists, right? That gets you left like not invited to the company retreats and things like that. You treat people badly all the time. People find ways to make it come back on you. But if it's out of character, right? If it's not usually how you behave, then we mostly just think, well, something must be really tough. Maybe like they have a family member who's sick or something like that, and they're too stressed and they've lost control of their behavior. Okay. Or if we think the person didn't know what they were doing, right? If a person didn't know that their action was wrong because they didn't understand some key feature of their action, like suppose I'm found in possession of a truck filled with like just a mountain of heroin, right? And your first reaction might be like, oh, you're a terrible person. You might have seen those stickers on the back of cars, kill your local heroin dealer, right? People put those stickers on the cars because they anticipate that the people who see it are going to be like, yeah, kill your local heroin dealer. We hate heroin dealers. But suppose it turns out I didn't think I was buying heroin. I thought I was buying rock salt. All right. So when someone dropped the truck off, they were like, we got your truck of stuff. And I'm like, all right, just leave it in the driveway. I'll get to it tomorrow. And then the cops show up and they open it up and they're like, you have like $30 million of heroin in here because there was like a mistake at the smuggler's office, right? They thought they took the heroin truck. They thought they took the rock salt truck, but they actually took the heroin truck. Well, then you're like, oh, he's not a heroin dealer. I mean, he's violating the law. He has a mountain of heroin in a truck, but he didn't know. Then you don't get angry at the person, right? Like the cops are probably going to be interested in like, how did you come across this much heroin? But you might not even go to jail. Right? You just admit what happened. The reason for this, Hume thinks, is that we don't only care about the behavior. We definitely care about the behavior. We want to take steps to prevent people from doing things we think are wrong, right? This is why we intervene so much when people are young, right? We have so many interventions geared towards helping children adapt themselves into society if it appears like they have trouble with that. Like violent kids, we put a lot of work into trying to make it so that they can operate well in society. That's about preventing future behavior. We definitely do care about that, but it's not all that we care about. Because in addition, we want to punish the people who engage in certain kinds of behavior. We want to blame them. And Hume thinks if you pay attention to when we punish them and when we blame them, it's really clear that what we care about when we punish and when we blame people is their choices more than their behavior. Right? Suppose you found out that someone did something really nice, but it was by accident. They were actually trying to do something really, really awful. Like suppose you someone gives all their money to a local charity and you're like, oh, what a great guy. And then you go talk to them and it turns out actually they were trying to defraud the charity, but they performed the bank operation wrong. So they ended up, instead of taking all the charity's money, they gave all their money to the charity. Then you're not going to be like, well, still nicely done, right? You're going to say like, you're a terrible person and I hate you. And I hope bad things happen to you and your children. Be a little over the top if you want bad things to happen to their children. But still, in that case, the behavior was good. But once you figure out that the cause of the behavior was a bad choice, then the blaming and the punishment comes in. So here's what Hume thinks. What we're interested in free will, or liberty, is the conditions under which it's appropriate to blame and punish people. It's also the conditions under which it's appropriate to reward people and praise people. But he focuses more, as most of us do, on the punishing and blaming case. And Hume says if you actually pay attention to the pattern of how we blame people and how we punish people, blaming and punishing is directed at choices, not behavior. And so we care about the behavior because it reflects the choice that was made. And the only way that's going to be the case is if behavior in general is determined by choices. Because we can't directly inspect people's choices. We can't observe their choices. We can only observe directly their behavior. And so, if free will or liberty is about the conditions under which people can be blamed or punished, the conditions under which they're morally responsible, you might say, for their own behavior, then this seems like exactly what freedom should be. Freedom is what a person has when it's the case that their behavior reflects their choices. So there's the case for Hume's account of free will. An account of free will on which we have free will even if determinism is true. An account of freedom on which we have free will partly because determinism is true. Because every event, including our behavior, has causes, and because those causes made the event happen. Right? Like suppose, as Hume would refuse to admit is possible, suppose we claimed that our choices caused our behavior, but it did so only probabilistically, so that given the choice, the behavior follows, but it only follows like 60% of the time. Right? Then we couldn't reliably read someone's choices off of their behavior. And then it wouldn't make sense to blame them or punish them. Because for all we know, they made a good choice, but it was one of those 4 out of 10 cases where it led to bad behavior. So that's Hume's account of what freedom is and how freedom can be compatible, in fact, maybe even require determinism. Right? And he thinks once you appreciate what causation really involves, you realize there's no forcing going on here. Right? There's no sense in which people are constrained. Right? There's no sense in which determinism rules out possibilities for them. All that's going on is people make choices. Those choices determine their behavior. Now, you might ask, what determines their choices? Well, probably what Hume would say is their desires and their beliefs, right? Like when you think about what makes you choose the things you do, it's usually that you choose the things you want. And you're choosing what seems to you the best way to get what you want. Right? So it's a combination of your beliefs about the world, your beliefs about like how you go about getting what you want, and what you actually want, your desires. What Hume says is, okay, so your beliefs and your desires together cause your choices, and your choices cause your behavior. Right? Everything's fine. This is where Hume would leave it. Now, here I'm going to get to that thing I said I would get to a little bit earlier, which is some conditions or cases where a lot of people are prepared to say that someone's not free, but nonetheless, they would be free according to Hume's definition. So I want you to think about someone who was raised in like a cult. Right? Every day they were forced to go to the cult's like weird religious services, and they were indoctrinated into the weird religious views of this cult. And let's say the cult says everyone must make continual sacrifices of their hair to the great god Joe. Right? Joe the god wants your hair. And so your job in life is to make your hair as long and as nice as possible so that you can make the appropriate sacrifices. And so every kid in this cult is brought up to desire lustrous, long hair so that they can cut it and burn it in offerings to Joe, the god. And suppose you find somebody who has the fervent desire to grow their hair long so that they can sacrifice it to Joe. And they have, let's say, ordinary beliefs about the world. Like if I want long, lustrous hair, I need to eat right. I need to, use conditioner and things like that. Joe likes silky smooth hair, let's say. And suppose that person behaves in accordance with their choices. Their choices they make in accordance with their beliefs and their desires. But their desires, and their beliefs about the world, one of which is that there's a hair-loving God named Joe, And let's say the cult says if Joe doesn't get enough hair, he's just one day going to murder everyone on Earth, right? So you're saving the world from Joe, the evil hair god. Well, suppose the person has those beliefs and has those desires, but they only have them because they've been indoctrinated by this cult. They've been kind of brainwashed. Right? Well, it seems like they would still count as free according to Hume's definition, but a lot of us would be like, no, 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 no. It matters why they make the choices they do. So it matters where they got the beliefs and the desires they did. How did they get them? What Hume's going to say is that doesn't matter, right? When it comes to deciding who's responsible, all we care about is that people's actions are a reliable guide to what's going on inside. And in the case of the cult children, it is. It just turns out that the cult has made these like really deluded individuals with terrible value systems, right? Let's say the cult members are like knocking over convenience stores in order to steal shampoo and conditioner because they want that really good stuff, that salon stuff. I don't know. It occurs to me I don't know the name of like a high quality shampoo or conditioner. Maybe this is a bad example for me to use, but a lot of people think the cult children in my example aren't free, right? That the brainwashing and the indoctrination is precisely why they aren't free. Whereas on Hume's definition, no, they're still free. And this is where the debate goes on from here. The way that Hume defends compatibilism by arguing that given his account of causation, it's clear that determinism was true, and given his account of free will or liberty, it's also clear that we have liberty in the case where determinism or the doctrine of necessity is true. That argument has been open up to criticisms from two directions. One criticism is that Hume's account of causation is wrong, and it's been a debate ever since Hume. But another one is that Hume's definition of freedom or liberty is wrong. Now, we're not going to get into this. I just wanted to make you aware that this debate continues. It goes on till today. What's important to realize is the way that everything in the book, everything in Hume's book, leads up to this argument about free will. This argument about free will is, I think, the centerpiece of the book. It's what everything was building towards. Because Hume wants to get rid of this problem. He thinks the free will problem isn't a real problem. It's a problem that only exists because people aren't clear what their ideas really are, what like the words they use mean. And this is a problem that actually has a whole lot of practical importance, right? When we decide how society should work, a large part of that is deciding who we treat as responsible for their behavior, right? It also involves thinking about how we change people's behavior. Now, if you believe that freedom is what Hume says, well, then it makes perfect sense to alter people's behavior by trying to alter their choices, by trying to like manipulate the rewards and the punishments that go along with certain choices. Right? This is exactly what Hume would have said would be a rational and reasonable way to proceed. But if you think that freedom involves something else, if you think freedom involves some lack of determination, then maybe we can't influence people's behavior that way. Right? And if you think it involves a lack of determination, then maybe if we find out that like the way people behave is a result of maybe like the way they were raised, then maybe we can't hold them responsible anymore. But then we've lost a key way we have of, Hume would say, controlling people. So these twin goals of holding people responsible and controlling society, right? Controlling how people behave, they go together for Hume. It's of great practical importance. It's also just of importance for like how we feel about our own lives, right? Imagine a world where you never got angry at anyone for treating you badly. Imagine a world where you never got to feel pride for your own successes. Imagine a world where no one ever felt shame for their own foul deeds. This is a terrible world, right? And Hume wants to say, we're not in that world. We have freedom. Freedom is just what happens when your choices lead to the behavior you chose. That's it. And determinism poses no problem for them. And in the final video, coming up next, we'll see that this pragmatic focus in Hume actually extends to his response to skepticism.